My name is Darren Reesberg. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and I want to thank all of you for taking time on what's turned out to be a beautiful Saturday to join us for what will be, I think, an exciting and very important panel entitled Beyond Borders, the Politics of Immigration Policy. As many of you know, the Institute of Politics here is really designed to try to instill in the students at the university a passion for politics and public service, and to do that by exposing students to practitioners in various ways. One of those ways is through our speaker series. And we hope, as part of our speaker series, to always bring to the students, as well as to the Chicago community at large, discussions about issues that are timely. And I think it's beyond argument that the issue of immigration today is as timely an issue as any, especially with the release by the Gang of Eight in the U.S. Senate of their proposal that I know many of you here in the room are quite familiar with and in many respects may be working on, both, again, the public as well as our own students, which we always love to see. Another important component of the Institute of Politics Speaker Series is that we like to have our events promoted, conceived, executed by our students. And this was a primary example of that type of collaboration. We at the Institute of Politics and our Student Advisory Council, which is made up of 15 students here at the university, both undergraduates and graduates, knew early on this quarter that immigration policy was going to be an issue that we wanted to discuss as part of our speaker series. But there were also many other registered student organizations across campus who actually played in this arena and wanted to do the same. And instead of having a number of different events that would dilute the force of an event, we came together and worked really hard to put forth what we think is going to be a great afternoon. So I want to thank everybody at the university, both students and administrators and faculty who were involved. I'll name a few, and I know I'm not naming everybody, so I'll have that caveat and catch-all out there first. Eduardo Cisneros and Jennifer Chan from the Harris School's Minorities and Public Policy Studies program. Abdul Dasunmu, who is one of our interns at the Institute of Politics and has been instrumental in helping us to put this together. He's a fourth year here at the college. Ronnie Rios at the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, OMSA. Michael Frankis and Vita Sikowski at the Roosevelt Institute. Jacob Lesniewski and Ariel Giovanni Ruiz Soto, who are from the School of Social Service Administration, the location in which we're in right now. We want to thank SSA for providing this great space. Susan Zesch, who you'll hear from momentarily, who leads our UChicago Human Rights Program. Manuela Londoño, who I will introduce to introduce Susan. She is with the UChicago Coalition for Immigrant Rights. And Maria Wolchin, who's from the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights here at the university. Before I introduce Manuela, I just wanted to highlight a few Institute of Politics events that will be upcoming over the course of this week. As many of you know, we have a fellows program where we have 5 practitioners who stay an entire quarter with us, and they actually run a weekly seminar or study group that's not for credit, but just an opportunity for students and others to come and hear from people who have done some amazing work in their careers. We have on Monday at 4:30 at the Institute of Politics House, Steve LaTourette, who was a congressman from Ohio for 18 years, just left Congress as one of John Boehner's top lieutenants, and he's going to be talking about the politics of debt and the deficit of trust in Washington. On Tuesday evening, we have a large public program around climate change, which will be over at the Assembly Hall at the International House. And that will be featuring, among others, the former administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency, Carol Browner, who was there during the Clinton years. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have another one of our fellow seminars at the House at 4:30, this one featuring our fellow Chris Liu, former cabinet secretary at the White House, whose talk as part of his 10-week seminar is The Power of Presidency in the Time of Gridlock. For more information about any of this, you can just go to our website at politics.uchicago.edu. And so let me introduce now Manuela Londoño, who I said was a large part of our efforts to put on this event today. So Manuela is a fourth-year student at the college who's majoring in visual arts. She's very involved in the UChicago Coalition on Immigrant Rights, as well as in a number of other organizations, including United We Dream, AFL-CIO, and Unite Here. Manuela is an immigrant from Medellin, Colombia, and so immigrant rights to her is very much a part of her life. And so we thank her again for all her work, and please join me in introducing Manuela.
Hey. Hi, everyone, and thank you all for coming this afternoon on such a wonderful day. Before beginning with the panelists, the University of Chicago, Susan Zesch, will give her opening remarks on the history of U.S. immigration policy and patterns throughout the last century or so. And this will provide the context for the current immigration debates. So just a little background on Susan Zesch. She is the executive director of the University of Chicago's Human Rights Program and a senior lecturer at the college. Her research interests include the interrelationships between human rights and migration policy, the history of U.S. immigration policy, and Mexico-U.S. relations. From 1996 to 2001, Susan Zesch was director of the Mexico-U.S. Advocates Network, now Enlaces America, and a founding member of the Regional Network of Civil Organizations for Migration. From 1997 to 1999, Zesch was the legal advisor to the Mexican Foreign Ministry on U.S. immigration law and policy. Susan Zesch received an AB from the University of Chicago in 1972 and a JD in 1977 from the University of Michigan. And this is just a little of like the many accomplishments that Susan Zesch has done throughout her life. So please, everyone, please welcome Susan Zesch.
I just started my timer for 15 minutes. Good afternoon. First, how many former students of mine are here? Okay, so you've heard the hour-and-a-half version of what I'm going to try to do in 10 minutes. We're very privileged and honored, and since I'm going to talk a bit about history as an amateur historian, I wanted to note for those of you who are here visiting the university, and those of you who go to school here who may not know it, that the School of Social Services Administration in particular, and the university in general, has a very long history of engagement with studying and understanding and advocating on issues which impact the lives of immigrants in the U.S. and immigration policy. This building, SSA, has a long, just on the other side of that partition, around the corner from where Professor Gonzalez is sitting, a little information case where you can read about Grace and Edith Abbott. Edith Abbott was the founding dean of SSA, and together with her sister Grace Abbott, formed part of the Hull House cohort of women gathered around Jane Addams, who worked in the early part of the 20th century to figure out how to make U.S. society a more humane and receptive place for immigrants to realize their dreams and live their lives. And so this building and this school really has a long history of working on that. Similarly, in the 1920s, a Mexican sociologist named Manuel Gamio was here at the University of Chicago doing pioneering research on issues such as remittances from Mexican immigrants. He studied Western Union MoneyGrams in order to understand what the financial relationship was between immigrants who were here working in this society to support their families in another society. He moved back to Mexico after doing his work here in the 20s and became really the father of modern sociology in Mexico. So this is some very early history of this university's engagement with these issues. I'm going to start way back, actually more than 100 years. Thanks to Manuela for a very nice introduction, but I'm going to skip back a little bit further and have you think about how it is that the U.S. has immigration policy and what that means and what it's meant in different eras, because it really feels to me, and I think it probably does to many of you, like we are on the brink of a fundamental redefinition of many parts of our immigration policy. And if we want to think of immigration policy broadly, it has to do with I think there are sort of three major factors. One is who does the United States allow to come into the U.S. from abroad? Secondly, what are the conditions under which people who are not citizens live in the United States, their rights and other aspects of their lives? And thirdly, how do we control access to citizenship? And all of these issues have been mediated in different ways by laws passed by the U.S. Congress over the course of our country's existence. So let me start with the very beginnings of what you could call immigration policy. And all of us have seen cartoons which show groups of Native Americans bemoaning the fact that they didn't have a good immigration policy to start with, and look at the mess that we're in now. So, but skipping over the centuries and millennia of indigenous settlement in North America, where there were in fact migrations both internal and external, I'm going to start with the period of the colonies. And many of us live with the myths that we learned in grade school, which tell us that people who came to the United States were seeking freedom, and that the colonies were a place where people could realize their desire to live in an open society. But in fact, the story of many of our colonies were that they had rules which restricted who could settle there. Plymouth Colony was certainly very strict about whether people obeyed particular religious laws, and if they didn't, they would be thrown out. And other colonies welcomed people from a wide variety of backgrounds, but others of the American colonies had very strict guidelines on who was and was not allowed to live there. So the colonies themselves, although we can talk about them as being a period of expansion, of trying to bring settlers in to displace the indigenous communities and take over the territory of what we now refer to as the United States, really didn't have an open settlement policy. At least many of them didn't. So it's something to think about, how the roots of restrictionism go way back to the beginnings of our history. Now, when the colonies pulled together and became the United States, and it took them until 1789 to come up with a constitution, it's important for our understanding of contemporary immigration policy and what immigration policy is to understand a couple of things about the Constitution. First of all, the Constitution does not mention slavery. Clearly, throughout the colonial period and until 1808, there was an active slave trade of the involuntary migration of tens of thousands of people from Africa to the North American continent to work. The Constitution only mentions slavery in a very indirect way, talking about how the importation of persons will have to end in 1808. The Constitution does not mention or define citizenship. It says that Congress will prescribe a uniform rule of naturalization, but it doesn't say what the contents of that is. And there are those, references to 3/5 of a person. There's this sort of coded references to slavery in the Constitution and citizenship, but we don't really get a federal definition of citizenship until we end slavery after the Civil War and we pass the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship as all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And the roots of birthright citizenship are very strong in the United States. And I think the ideas that some contemporary groups have of changing those rules are somewhat ignorant of how deep our definition of a nation is in its roots in the 14th Amendment, the post-Civil War redefinition of who is an American and how do we define ourselves. Now, the 19th century generally has been seen as an era of generally open immigration. The Midwest states, of course, were encouraging white settlers to come from Europe. In fact, the legislatures of a number of Midwestern states in the pre-Civil War period were funding recruitment in Northern and Western Europe to bring settlers to the United States. They have legislative appropriations from the state legislature of Iowa or Minnesota or Wisconsin to send recruiters to get people to come settle in their states. The other thing that was going on during that period in terms of arrival and settlement were restrictive laws, again at the local level, within the territory of the United States, regulating the movement and settlement of free blacks. Not only fugitive slave laws destined to return slaves to the expel them, deport them back to the South if they were found in areas of the North, but free blacks, including people who had been born free, were restricted from settling in certain parts of the U.S., including Illinois, which in, I think it's 1843, passed passed a law that prohibited the settlement of people of African descent in our state. So this is sort of a, how do we define community? Who gets to be here? Who doesn't get to be here? There are a lot of variations of this in U.S. history. Now, the other things going on during the 19th century that is important to our understanding was the importation of guest workers, so-called, from China, who were responsible for the development and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and a lot of the preliminary labor to develop mining in the western part of the U.S. Now, after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, we all know that picture, 1869, the Golden Spike, and there's that funny poster where the two pieces of the track don't meet, and what are they going to do? But after the railroad was finished, there began to be some agitation on the West Coast in a very virulent, racist, violent actions against Chinese workers in many parts of the West. There was a massacre in Ludlow, Colorado, of Chinese in a mining camp, and this history of an anti-Asian sentiment that began to develop in an economic depression immediately after the end of the railroad results ultimately by the 1880s, and then finally putting the cap on it in 1907, in the gradual and then total exclusion of new Asian immigration to the United States for a very, very long time. One of the things that happened during that period then, as the Asian immigrants were being excluded, deported, and no new arrivals were going to be permitted to come in, there was a need for a labor force to maintain the railroad beds that the Chinese had built, to work in the newly developing corporate scale agriculture that was happening in the West because we'd invented irrigation technology, which would allow large farms to be built and sustained in areas where there wasn't enough natural rainfall. And the workforce that was going to work in these sort of new plantations, well, we'd kicked out the Chinese. Where do you think they went to look for workers? Mexico. And Mexico, during the period of 1880 to 1910, is living through the dictatorship presidency of Porfirio Diaz, who saw himself as a modernizer. And part of what he was doing as a modernizer in Mexico was throwing peasants off of their land. And so there's tremendous social disruption going on in Mexico, which is bad enough that it ultimately results in the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. But the conditions of displacement and starvation made this Mexican population very susceptible to the recruitment from the United States to replace the excluded Chinese workers. And so the exclusion of Asians becomes the opening where the U.S. begins a very long-term and active recruitment of workers to come in from Mexico. Now, I'm going to tell you about a couple of other trends. I see I have 4.5 minutes, and I still have 100 years to get through. We'll see how quickly we can do it. Let me just talk about trends, maybe, rather than facts. After the exclusion of the Asians almost completely from immigration, a philosophy or ideology in the U.S., which is popularly known as eugenics, which I would put as a subtitle racism, it's scientific racism, started popularizing ideas about the superiority of certain racial groups over others. And immigrants, and particularly Jews from Eastern Europe and Catholics from places like Italy and Poland, were regarded as being inherently inferior to the present white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population in the United States. Of course, they'd started regretting having open immigration when the Irish started arriving in the mid-19th century, and then the Jews and the Poles and the Italians are adding to this Catholic and Jewish mix. These people are different. You can read work from the period which describes Italians as being prone to criminal activity and Jews having, I forget, small heads or something. I forget how it goes. But really sort of this pseudoscientific basis for developing an immigration policy which first starts excluding people based on their personal qualities and then ends up excluding, in legislation that passes in 1922 and 1924, entire national groups, basically barring new immigration, except for very tiny quotas, from Southern and Eastern Europe. So by the time we get to the end of the 20s, we have barred Asian immigration almost entirely. We have restricted and almost entirely barred immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Mexicans are still being allowed into the U.S. because their labor is needed. In fact, during World War I, the Secretary of Agriculture moved to make sure that a literacy exclusion, in other words, you couldn't come into the U.S. if you couldn't read and write in your own language, was not enforced against the Mexican workforce that was being recruited to work in agriculture during a period when the United States needed labor for the war effort. And that's a pattern that repeats itself after the Depression, which has large-scale deportations. When we get into World War II, the U.S. sets up for the first and only time a bilateral immigration program with Mexico to bring temporary workers in to work in agriculture and railroad maintenance, which becomes known as the Bracero program. And the Bracero program continues until not only all through World War II, because this is a very good way to have a flexible, low-cost labor pool available for these very important jobs in the U.S. economy, but it continues until 1965. Now, in the post-war period, post-World War II period, which is very important in terms of the establishment of a lot of international institutions, and when the U.S. begins to think about revising its immigration policy based on the sort of new world order of the post-World War II period, there's a push to get rid of these national origins quotas and the Asian exclusions on the part of those communities here in the U.S. and their allies, many of them from the religious community. And so there's a huge push in 1952 when Congress is revising all of the immigration laws in what becomes known as the McCarran-Walter Act to get rid of the Asian exclusion and of these hated quotas from the 1920s. In the post-war period, there had been some small fixes to those. We passed a War Brides Act, which allowed American GIs to bring their Asian wives home, so that begins to kind of get Americans used to the fact that there could be new Asian immigration. And in 1948, Congress had passed a Displaced Persons Act. However, Harry Truman tried to veto it because he found that the way the quotas were set as to who could come in from the displaced persons camp in Europe to be explicitly anti-Semitic and set up in a way to limit the number of Jews who were allowed to come in favor of their Christian co-nationals who were trying to get away from communist rule in the countries of Eastern Europe. So this wasn't very promising that the Displaced Persons Act still in 1948 still maintains some of these prejudices that were still in the law from the 1920s. I'm supposed to be done. I'm going to do a couple more minutes. That there's this big push in 1952, and it fails. But President Truman is on the side of immigration reform, and he sets up a presidential commission to go around the country and hold hearings so that the groups that want to get rid of the national origins quotas are able to do organizing in cities all over the country around the sessions of this presidential commission. And apparently my first appearance at an immigration event was in 1952 in my mother's stroller. She was part of the National Council of Jewish Women who went to the meetings for the visit of the Truman Commission to Chicago. So that was my first immigrant work. But it really took, and I'm going to do the rest of this in 3 sentences, the energy and determination of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to help push these hated racist quotas out of U.S. immigration law. So finally, in 1965, Congress revises the immigration law and comes up with the system for allowing people to become permanent residents that we have today, and which we are now on the brink of revising and changing almost entirely. But it opens the U.S. to immigration worldwide, allowing immigration in from all parts of the world with a per-country cap of 20,000 people. But our Congress has always believed in true love, so the spouses of U.S. citizens were able to come in not included in those per-country caps and over and above the quotas. Let's see if that expands now with the end of the Defense of Marriage Act so that we really believe in true love. But what happened in 1965 that was good for the rest of the world turns out to be bad for Mexico and Latin America. Congress decides at the end of the Bracero program to put Mexico and the countries of the Americas under a hemispheric quota, which will allow 100,000 immigrants per year to come in from the Americas. Mexicans take up 80% of that. And then in 1976, Congress decides in an act of so-called fairness that they will put Mexico under the same country quotas as every other country in the world. And we end up, as Doug Massey, who used to be a professor of sociology here and is now at Penn, says, we changed a flow of people which had been encouraged over a long period of the recruitment during the Porfiriato to get people to work in the railroads, of the World War I encouragement of Mexican immigration, of the Bracero program from 1942 to 1965. So we have patterns of migration set up, which suddenly in 1965 and 76 go from being largely legal to being largely illegal by the change in the law. The trends are there, but we've changed the label. And so now, in 2013, we have a chance to address what was a fundamental mistake in the way the U.S. Congress in 1965 and 76 decided to treat immigration from Mexico. I'm not sure what the conclusions are going to be overall. I'm not sure if we're going to like the way, and a lot of people aren't, the categories of who can bring their close relatives into the U.S. are going to be changed. The way that we deal with the need for workers in certain sectors of the economy, so it's not just an unregulated, undocumented workflow, but has some controls on it, and some caps, and some numbers, and some regulation. But we'll see, because we've seen since 76 the need in 86 to do a massive legalization. In 1994, there starts to be increased border enforcement. That doesn't cut the amount of people who are coming here undocumented. We see in 2006 massive, large-scale demonstrations by immigrants themselves who decide they don't want a solution that's going to criminalize them. And now in 2013, all of these forces are coming together. Restrictionists, people who want liberal immigration, immigrant communities who want access to be able to get their family members here to live with them. And we're going to see a complete redo. I think we really are on the brink of something quite historic, and I'm not sure how it's going to come out, of this story that I've started to tell you about how the U.S. Congress has decided who can enter, who can stay, and who can be a citizen. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Chan, and I'm a second-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy and also on the Executive Board of Minorities in Public Policy. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for coming here today. When I was trying to get my friends to come to this event, I was told it was prime study time. So thank you all for making that sacrifice to be here. So this next panel is on immigration today. And as some of you may know, the last major overhaul of immigration law was in 1986 under President Reagan. And immigration law hasn't really changed very much since then. So we have 4 panelists here today who are going to tell you how our current immigration policies impact people, communities, and businesses. Our first panelist, starting from my far right, is Cindy Augustine. She's the Youth Civic Leadership Trainer of the Uniting America program at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. The program seeks to build connections between immigrant and non-immigrant communities through community events, citizenship workshops, and youth leadership. And she's also an alum of the college. Our next panelist is Otz Bolisai, who's born and raised in the Bahamas and currently lives in Seattle with his partner Ken, and also works at the state's largest immigrant rights organization, One America. Otz has spent the majority of his adult life in the United States, first on a student visa, then on an H-1B visa, which is the visa for high-skilled workers. Since marriage equality passed in Washington State this past November, he and his partner have been outspoken on how this victory does not help binational same-sex couples, and next year, Otz's work visa is set to expire, and without immigration reform legislation that includes LGBT immigrants, he'll be forced to leave this country and the life he and his partner have spent over 10 years building together. Our next panelist is John Rowe, the Chairman Emeritus of Exelon Corporation, one of the largest electric utility companies in the country. He's a trained lawyer and has spent over 2 decades as the top executive in utility industries, and also serves as the co-chair on the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Immigrant Task Force. And our final panelist is Roberto Gonzalez, who is assistant professor here at SSA and received his PhD at the University of California, Irvine. And he's recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on undocumented youth and young adults. His work has been featured in numerous scholarly articles in national news media, including CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. And finally, this panel will be moderated by Steve Edwards, who is the Deputy Director of Programming at the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago. He's covered politics and public policy for over 2 decades as a journalist and program host, most recently at WBEZ, which, as many of you know, is Chicago's NPR member station. And from 2007 to 2008, he studied the impact of Latin American immigrants to the United States as a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. So please join me in welcoming our first panel.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Susan, thank you so much for framing the context for what will be the first of 2 conversations today. And just to set the stage, in many respects, we have our guide at the banner atop here, Defining Problems, Shaping Solutions. This first panel will be focused on problems with the existing immigration landscape. One of the things that's so interesting about this policy debate is no matter where you come from and what your political point of view is on immigration, one thing that there seems to be broad consensus around is the idea that the current status, the current situation is broken. The current system is broken. There are lots of differing points of view on how best to fix it, and we'll talk more about that. But as we continue this conversation, we'll dive into some of the ways in which the current system is untenable for individuals and for families, for communities, for the economy, for security, and so forth. I want to ask each of my panelists before we jump in just to scoot the microphone or themselves a bit closer so we actually have good miking here. And I want to open, actually, with a general question to some of you. And Cindy, I'm going to start with you on this. I would love to know how you came to this issue, both personally but also professionally, as a mode of significant interest and investigation for you.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cindy Agustin, and I actually am an undocumented immigrant. My family came to the United States over 20 years ago in 1992. I was only 3 years old, and my sister was 2 months old, and we actually crossed the border. So if you can imagine right now a 19-year-old mother, a 21-year-old father, a 3-year-old, and a 2-month-old crossing the border, that's what my parents did in 92. And so I grew up in back of the yards on the southwest side of Chicago, so not too far from here. And immigration was always something that we always talked about, right? Family members were coming over, crossing la frontera with los coyotes, nogales, right? All of these key words. But we never really talked about being undocumented. It was one of those things that you knew about, but you don't talk about it. It wasn't until I got to the University of Chicago when I started realizing that not many have the opportunities that I had at that point, being able to go to a school like the University of Chicago, not having to worry about financial aid at that point, right? But also, when I was here, there wasn't any access to any of the resources that, a lot of the students have access to: internships, research assistant positions, right? I wasn't able to work. I wasn't able to take on, apply to the internships. I wasn't able to go abroad. And so I was missing out on all of these experiences. And during my 3rd year, actually, Josh Hoyt, former executive director of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, came to campus and he was talking about what was going on around immigration. At that point, I was very sheltered. I didn't want to know anything about immigration. It was just too much. And he mentioned that under Obama's administration, we had been deporting the most number of immigrants ever. And that's when it hit me that this was a person that was going to give us immigration reform within the first 100 days. This was a person that was going to help us. This was a person that I believed would bring some change, and he's hurting our community. And so that's when I started organizing on campus and was one of the co-founders of the UChicago Coalition for Immigrant Rights, who is co-hosting this event. And we started pushing for the issue of undocumented students on campus. At that point, I and another student were the only two students on campus who were undocumented and enrolled here. My fourth year, I was the only one that I knew of. And so we were talking to the administration about why is it that we don't have that many other students here? Why is it that that's never something that we talk about? And so I started pushing for that, and locally, nationally pushing for the Federal DREAM Act at that point in 2010. I've been organizing with the Immigrant Youth Justice League as well since 2010 and pushing for resources for undocumented youth and documented students such as myself to have access to everything that I have. And I continue to do this work now at a nonprofit, and now I work with deferred action eligible youth. I work with immigrant youth, and we'll see where I go.
And I want to get you, Professor Gonzalez, in on this too, because in many respects, the experiences that Cindy is talking about is the focus of your research as well. Sure. You have said before that for undocumented youth in the United States, they have to undergo a process of learning to be illegal. What does that mean exactly? Sure. What are the impacts here?
Well, I've been studying this population formally for the last 10 years, and I think working with this population for the last 20, 10 as a youth worker in Chicago, in the last 10 doing research in California, in the state of Washington and Illinois. And for young people like Cindy who come to the United States at very early ages, because of our Supreme Court ruling in 1982 in Plyler versus Doe, they can attend K through 12 public school free and legal. So as a result, are integrated from day one into the legal framework of this country. Very different from parents who come here and are absorbed into low-wage labor markets. And as the cliche goes, in the shadows, children, by contrast, live in the sunshine, grow up side by side with American-born peers, pledge allegiance to a flag, move through school, accumulating Americanizing experiences, grow up to Barney and the Power Rangers, to Twilight. They go to the prom, do everything their American-born peers are doing, but at around 15, 16, 17 years old, as their friends are getting their driver's licenses, as their friends are taking their first jobs, as their friends are getting financial aid for college, as their friends are starting to take careers, they have to wait. Our laws treat children and adults differently, but don't account for the continuity of children becoming adults.
I want to get John Rowan on this, but let me go back to Otts for a second. We heard the outlines of your personal story in Jennifer's introduction, and I'm curious to know, as a follow-up, based on your own experiences, how much does Cindy's story and what Roberto is talking about resonate for you here in the United States?
It resonates a lot because I think as an immigrant, and I wasn't really aware of this at the time, but you kind of train yourself to not rock the boat, to not speak up, and to not appear at things like this and identify yourself as such, because, border agents can really mess with you if they're having a bad day, if they're feeling homophobic. They can actually take time off of your visa. So
just by that one interaction with that person who's vested with power in that instance.
Yes. So I went through my life here in the States, either going to school or working, not appearing at these kinds of things. But the thing is I started working at a technology support outfit, and we supported a lot of nonprofits that worked with immigrants. And there was something, I think in 2003, 2004, called the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride, which kind of were modeled on the freedom rides of the 1960s, where a lot of immigrants around the country got on buses and all kind of converged on DC to kind of lobby for immigration reform. And the thing is folks were like, hey, why don't you come? I was like, oh God, there's no way I would do something like that. But I would actually see people who were undocumented, who had way more to lose than I did, put themselves out there. They would drive through Arizona. They were actually stopped by Border Patrol in Arizona. And it was extremely brave, I thought. And I was like, okay, so it forced me to sort of look at my situation and what I was willing to do for this. So I think for people who are undocumented, who are really sort of pushing the envelope in terms of how do we move this debate forward. I think it helped me sort of to redefine my position to the issue.
Now, I want to follow up and talk more about H-1B and the complexities there and some of these other issues, but let me bring John Rowe in. And, you know, John, I think an obvious question for those who don't know your background on this issue would be, all right, why is the chairman emeritus of one of the most powerful utility companies in the United States, a business and civic leader who's on all sorts of boards, who's on the Field Museum, the Art Institute, and so forth, why are you spending time on this issue? How did you come to it?
Well, the amusing answer would probably be that utility executives get beat up as often as other people. But the more serious answer is that my wife and I sponsor 2 charter schools, and about half the students in those schools, about 1/3 in the high school, about 2/3 in the elementary school, are Latino, and a large portion of them are undocumented. A great many young people in exactly Cindy's position. And my wife and I give scholarships, and we try to counsel. When you sit with a young person whom you think is bright and working hard and decent and often sweet and getting good grades, and that person looks at you and says, "Mr. Rowe, can I really go to college and get a good job?" And you have to answer, "I can get you to college, but I can't guarantee that you can get a good job, and I couldn't hire you at my own company." That's just a bad answer. And so those individuals were the motivator. Like a lot of people, I'm much more motivated by real people and real context than by abstractions. But for me, as somebody who deeply believes that making market economies work well for people is the better alternative than statism of either the right or the left, this is just one more place where you go to work to make the system work for people. And the more time I have spent on the issue, again, motivated by kids I could name, except they might not want me to name them or else their parents wouldn't. But, you know, the more you realize that there is an economic need both at the high and the low end of the skill set to keep this country growing. So I get to the economic case that everybody wants the tame businessman to do, but I start with the individual hearts and feelings just like the rest of you. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs spent 1.5 years on a major study on this. We recommended substantial and comprehensive immigration reform for all the reasons that will be discussed here today. For once, we got lucky. Our report came out about 6 weeks ago, and it was a good time. And then, working with several other organizations, I helped put together the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition, and Michael DeHeeger out there will take your names and your money very, very readily. We could use many names, but he could use some checks even more. And, you know, we're trying to put some practical politics. And here again, as the market guy, my job is working on Republicans.
Yeah. One of the things I want to get into is the economic argument and what's at stake here. But let me, to you and also to Cindy, push back on the first part of your example there. You know what the argument is from some in this conversation, and that is, you know, at the end of the day, whether you're a child of an undocumented immigrant or you yourself came here undocumented, that the law is the law. Rules are rules. What do you say to that?
What I say is the law is the law. We ought to have laws that we can enforce fairly and decently. I don't want this country to have a Gestapo throwing out 11 million people. I don't want this company to have a group of black and tans throwing out people. I want decent laws that can be fairly and effectively enforced. And to take it out on Cindy that she was brought here at 3, I'm sorry, that's the stuff you throw up over.
Yeah, and Cindy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the laws are outdated. There wasn't a way for my parents to come here the right way. They didn't have any money. We didn't have any U.S. citizen family members here who could sponsor us. So, you know, the law is a lot, but the laws are outdated right now. And, you know, if we enforce these, you know, these deportation quotas, if you send me back to Mexico, guess what I'm taking back with me? You've invested already in my education. I went to kindergarten all the way through college here, right? And you're deporting these people back, and they're taking back everything you've invested into them, right? So it only makes sense that we are now integrated into this country. Me as someone that graduated from college, my parents as people who have been working for 20 years, paying taxes, paying into Social Security that they'll never ever see. And it's time that we figure something out so that we don't have 11 million people living the way that we're living now.
Roberto, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to broaden the circle a little bit and kind of build off of some of Susan's remarks and really look at the last 30 years. And what's happened is that shortly after the last legalization in 1986, what happened is the United States started investing billions of dollars on enforcement. And so what that meant was an increased number of agents on the border, a longer and taller fence, and increased surveillance technology. We're now talking about drones on the border, right? And as a result, what happened is that it became a lot more difficult, a lot more costly, and a lot more dangerous to cross, right? And Susan mentioned some 100 years of Mexican labor coming into the United States. For a long time, what was the norm was that migrants would leave their children and families at home, right, and work in the United States for a few months at a time and then go back home. But it became a lot more difficult, costly, and dangerous to cross. Labor demand didn't change for a long time. And instead, what happened was that families started bringing, or migrants rather, started bringing their families. So we see from the late 1980s, after the legalization, where undocumented migration in this country was almost around 2 million, to it mushrooming sixfold, right, in 20 years. Right. As a result, people could not really, what we did is that we hemmed in a large, settled, undocumented population without rights. And one additional point, in addition to this kind of large, growing undocumented population, really immigrant families have experienced 2 really important trends, 2 unsettling trends. And one is, over the last 20 to 30 years, immigrant families or non-immigrants have seen a shrinking of rights, right? Gradually, rights for non-citizens have eroded.
In what ways?
After the 96 bill, after the changes in our law in 1996, non-citizens became ineligible for a number of benefits. And we've gradually stripped away benefits over the years. At the same time, our enforcement efforts have spiked, such that in the last 3 years, more than 1.5 million, we're on pace to deport 2 million people. But those enforcement efforts have also extended to communities and extended from immigration authorities to local police, right, healthcare officials, teachers, social workers, such that today, a walk in the park or an improper lane change, right, can result in arrest, detention, and deportation, sowing fear and worry in immigrant communities.
And what are the impacts of that, from your perspective as a scholar, and Otts from your perspective, and Cindy's yours personally? Roberto?
Sure. I think that what's happened is that the effect on people's everyday life is that movement has become narrowly restricted. People's everyday lives have become narrowly circumscribed by laws, such that movement is really difficult for a lot of undocumented people. Everyday mundane activities has become very difficult. I mentioned a 10-year study of mine in Los Angeles, and I set out with some basic sociological questions about education, about work, about family. What I didn't expect to find was, and almost to the person of those that I talked to, was that many of the young people that I interviewed described physical and emotional manifestations of stress. So chronic headaches, chronic toothaches, trouble sleeping, trouble getting out of bed, ulcers, thoughts of suicide, attempted suicide, right? Is that the narrowing of everyday life coupled with a continuous stress, right, has had profound implications on people's bodies.
I think it's important to bring it back down to people, because when you get into something like immigration law, especially talking to regular folks who aren't quite maybe as up to speed on it, their analysis quite hasn't developed yet, that you need to really keep it relatable. And the law is so complex, it's so incendiary that people can really sort of go down the wrong path. So in bringing it back down to real people and those sort of effects that you're sort of seeing in your study, I think for me, and you know, we talked about laws and we talked about rules earlier. So for somebody like me, I've always had a visa that was always some kind of temporary status, whether it was a student visa, a tourist visa, a work visa. The conditions of being granted that visa was that I always leave at a certain date in the future. The thing is, you know, we talk about home and going back home. I came to this country when I was 16. It's just the British school system in the Bahamas. I started college when I was 16. And I think at this point in my life, I've been 24, 25 years here. What happens when your notion of home shifts? I've had this much time on a temporary status to work, to find community, to fall in love, maybe to get married. So this is my notion of home. You know, I look around, I see beautiful queer people. I look around, I see beautiful Asian and Pacific Islander people. I see my partner. This is what I feel is my home. But now all of a sudden I have to leave. And so even with the laws and the rules in place, I think when you bring it back down to real people, if your notion of home shifts and it's suddenly here, but you know, the piece of paper says that, well, you have to leave even after we've given you this time to establish the sense of home, then something is wrong with that, and that's what we need to fix.
Yeah, and you know, you were in your introduction, we were alluding to your H-1B status, which is a big part of this conversation for a certain segment of the population too, and a certain segment of the economy. How does that factor into the way you think about life, and what's wrong with the H-1B visa situation from your point of view?
Well, the problem is I'm not a superstar. I have an English degree, and especially now with the Senate bill that came out, you know, they kind of want to prioritize the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math. And, you know, I'm kind of smart, but I'm not that smart. So
if you literally were a rocket scientist, you'd be in better shape, right?
Yeah. So, yes, an H-1B is a path to a green card, which then is a path to citizenship. But for, you know, a regular old English degree person who just does communications, I'm not that special. According to these laws, to be allowed to stay. And, you know, I think on some level I'm okay with that. But at the same time, again, the laws just don't really have any relation to what real life is for people. You know, you come here, and initially, I mean, like I said, I moved here when I was 16. I had no idea where I wanted to go. You know, I had no idea what I wanted to be, where I wanted to live for the rest of my life, what I wanted to do. But yet I found that here. And to then, you know, suddenly I have nowhere to go after that. You know, to sever all of these ties that I've built here. Again, it doesn't seem right. So,
John Rowe, from the perspective of an employer, whether it's quote unquote high skilled or lower skilled workers, what challenges do the current matrix of laws have on companies like your former one or across the economic spectrum?
Well, the truth is, in the short run, for an employer like Exelon, which mostly employs union labor, and in its professional ranks, mostly people with fairly high STEM skills, there isn't a lot of trouble at the moment hiring good people. But as you look down the road, it doesn't seem to work anymore. We certainly need more engineers if we want to be competitive on an international basis. And one of my engineering professor friends says, John, you know that the kids of the upper middle class never studied engineering. Turns out if we want to have engineers, we need immigrants. And I can assure you Exelon wants engineers. But in my work on the Global Affairs Council, I saw this from the angle of a whole lot of other kinds of employers. Governor Rounds of South Dakota had remarks on the poultry industry in South Dakota. Now, I hadn't previously considered South Dakota an important destination for immigrants before. But it seems that the poultry industry in South Dakota is dominated by a religious group called the Hutterites. That took me to my iPad. But apparently there are enough Hutterites to own and manage a large number of poultry businesses. But even with a fairly old-fashioned set of family values, they don't produce enough children to work in all these poultry businesses. And I could go on, but you know, how many well-to-do people do I know that have what we foolishly call low-skilled people caring for their children? How many, quote, modern families, something my wife says I only begin to understand, how many modern families are depending on somebody we call low-skilled so that both of those people can work in a highly competitive workforce? It's easy, as my colleague on my right pointed out, to focus on the high-skilled and where they fit in the spectrum. I think we're equally dependent on the so-called low-skilled.
What do the rest of you think of that? Cindy, what's your sense? Yeah.
I mean, I think just laws in general, laws are interesting when laws tell you, you know, from a personal experience, right? Laws tell me I don't belong here. I shouldn't be here. My parents shouldn't be here. Everything I do here is illegal. I am an illegal according to these laws, according to the rhetoric that's being used. And yet I was accepted when I was, you know, when I was in kindergarten and first grade, right? My friends were my friends. They didn't care where I was born. When I was in high school, they didn't care where I was born. When I was in college, my professors didn't care if I was from here, from there. They still graded me the same way that they graded everyone, right? So it's interesting to see, you know, and it's interesting growing up in a, you know, being constantly told that the law says you shouldn't be here, the law says you shouldn't be here, and you are constantly telling yourself, no, but I should. I feel like I belong here. And now it's even more interesting because last year we had the deferred action for childhood arrivals. Now I am protected. I do belong here because I'm protected from deportation for at least 2 years. I have a work permit. I can work, right? But my parents can't. And it's interesting because, oh, I deserve this, but my parents don't because of this policy. And now with immigration reform coming up, right, if you look at the bill right now, there is a dream provision where if it passes the way that it is now, I would be able to get my citizenship in 5 years, and my parents would have to wait another 13, 15 years on top of the 20 that they've been here now. And so it's interesting the way that laws don't actually look at the way that it's affecting people.
We're going to talk more about the legislation coming out of the Senate, the proposed approach from the Gang of Eight on this. But just to pick up on that, what do you think of the requirement that those who are here undocumented, adults in particular, would have to go through a path that would look at about 13 years through the process before they'd have an opportunity to get permanent resident status?
I think it's ridiculous, to be honest. I think of my parents who have been here for 20 years, 21 years now, living here undocumented, working, paying taxes, never done anything wrong, and yet they have to wait that long.
And what about the argument on the other side, though, that we hear Look what happened in 1986. Look what happened to immigration rates after that law was passed. By allowing people to become permanent residents more quickly, you only just further incentivize people to violate the existing or future laws. What do you say about that?
Well, the 1986 law was amnesty. They were focusing more on the people that were here already, who were living here undocumented, the 3 million undocumented people back then. It didn't really address the issue of how are people going to be coming into the U.S. And so it's, you know, in order to have a real comprehensive immigration reform, we need to address that so that we don't have 11 million undocumented people 27 years from now. I don't want to be doing this work 27 years from now doing the same thing, right? And I don't think any of us want to do this again, right? And so we need to think about what exactly does comprehensive mean. We need to figure out how to not create an underclass in 26 years and have others. For me, I don't want another young person who comes here at 3 years old 3 years from now and have to go through what I had to go through.
Roberto, what should comprehensive mean if we're thinking about this in the biggest picture, not just from a policy standpoint, but almost even from a cultural standpoint?
Well, I think that, I mean, certainly we have upwards of 11.1, 11.5 million undocumented people living here. The large number of undocumented immigrants live in families. And so to think comprehensively really requires us to think about those that live here, what we do with them, how we set upon regularizing their status, but also how we work to integrate them into our economy, into communities, so that legalization means something more than a piece of paper. I think that if we think about the current bill, I've got 3 real questions. I think piggybacking on Cindy, what are the consequences for individuals and their families of these very long waits? Number 2, who gets left behind? And then number 3, I mentioned earlier what we've done in terms of enforcement in this country, and it seems like a lot of the present bill is really jacking that up even more. And so what will be the system that gets put into place after we deal with the people who are living here?
And from your perspective, because throughout this debate, we'll hear from folks who think the enforcement provisions are necessary or should be tightened further. Sure. What's problematic about the enforcement provisions in this bill from your point of view?
Sure. Well, I think that we're if I would be so provocative, I think that for many people the demographic writing is on the wall. Susan mentioned a very long history of migration from Mexico and a very long history of labor migration, a long relationship. Many people have been talking, especially since the election, of the importance of the Latino vote and this changing, growing demographic of Latinos. I have been thinking a lot lately and talking to colleagues about what this extreme enforcement means and what we're going to get in terms of new immigrants in this country, and are we favoring migration from other parts of the world and trying really to stem migration from Latin America.
Yeah. Otz, I want to pick up on one piece of this that Professor Gonzalez mentioned about, I don't know if I have the phrase right, but essentially who's in or sort of who is allowed to sort of participate fully in society. You've been outspoken on this very issue when it comes to the proposal on the table from the Senate. And that has to do with the provisions allowed for same-sex couples in the debate and in the proposal therein. What is the real-world effect of a law that doesn't allow benefits for same-sex couples, in your view?
Well, the real-life effect is that a family like mine and my partner's is that once my visa expires, even if we happen to live in a state that just passed marriage equality, woo, but it doesn't help us. You know, since immigration is a federal right and that's just a state right, he can't sponsor me to stay in the same way that a straight couple can sponsor it.
And so if this law were passed and signed, and if this legislation were signed into law, what would you do? What would be your pathway?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, I didn't read the full 844 pages, I admit. But
that's the third panel. We're going to do a public reading of that.
It's interesting. I was talking with Jennifer Chan about it, and we were like, wow, it's as if they had me in mind, and they like crossed off every single pathway for me. So, okay, one, there's the exclusion of LGBT families, right? No same-sex couples. Two, my brother, who's over there holding up his phone recording this, he sponsored me, thank you, in 2002. Guess what? It's like 11 years later, and it's still in process. There's a, you know, they issue the visa bulletin every month, and, you know, my partner checks it. I can't look at that thing. My partner looks at it, and he's like, all right, so if they continue at the current rate of processing, it's going to be 17 years. Okay, so my parents, our parents are Filipino, and you always hear the Philippines used as an example of, oh my God, it's 24 years. So even though I'm from the Bahamas, it's still 17 years, which is pretty close to 24. So, okay, LGBT families excluded. Family sponsorship, they're actually looking at taking out the sibling category and like severely curtailing family-based immigration and shifting to employment-based, which, hello, leaves out women, because women are like, women immigrants have unique needs, and a lot of women immigrants come in through family-based sponsorship through their spouses. So that leaves issues of human trafficking and things like that. They're like especially vulnerable to that stuff. Third is the H-1B category thing, where and this is the one that I feel less informed about, but I think they're looking to bulk up the whole STEM thing, and we already established I'm not a superstar. And then I think for like large companies like Microsoft or something that employ huge numbers of H-1B workers, they're looking to require them to pay them more money as like a disincentive to use H-1B workers over native workers. So at least those three paths of me following the rules, they're kind of closed off to me now if the bill in its current state goes forward.
I want to open this up to questions from all of you, and I know that we're going to have some microphones moving through the room. So what we'd ask is those of you who have a question for one of our panelists to raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone over to you. But as that process gets underway, John, let me come back to you, John. You alluded to this, but I'm curious from the standpoint of the Midwest, especially, not just nationally, what's at stake here with this debate and how it ends? What do you think is at issue fundamentally here?
What's at stake is whether Cindy can stay and stay peacefully. What's at stake is real people who hurt, bleed. What's at stake is people who have the talents and capabilities to make this country better and stronger. It's real people who are at stake, and this is why I disagree slightly with her on the waiting periods in the Act. I mean, if I were czar, which all utility executives wish to be, it would be a more open bill than it is. But when you go back to this issue of people came in violation of the law, we're making huge progresses if first you're safe from deportation. Second, you can get legal work. Third, you can see an end. It's a very big deal. A lot of pain has been taken away. If we can get this bill, we shouldn't ignore all those things.
Let's take some questions from those of you here. Yeah, so why don't we go? We'll go right here in front with this gentleman first. And
thank you. My name is Alejandro Moreno. I have a question for you, Mr. Yoren. Thank you for the great job you're doing. How you can speak to people who live in the suburbs who are middle class, who are not worried about the human hurt of this immigration issue? How do you talk to them and tell them that it's important to support immigration reform? I'm talking about the suburbs who are, you know, middle class, and they are not really worried about it immigration?
Good question, because you're describing the people I grew up with who all look the same. And they don't necessarily all want their communities to change, even if some of that change is inevitable. I just look them in the eye because it happens I come from there so I can speak with some credibility and say, look, you value families, so do most of our immigrants. You value hard work, so do most of our immigrants. You want people who will try to contribute, so do most of our immigrants. Bet on people's hearts and not on your fears. But I was reminded during Susan's opening, one of the African American girls at my charter school looked at me one day and said, Mr. Rowe, where does racism start? And I said, well, how do you all feel about the kids down at the Standard Public School 4 blocks down the street? Almost unanimously they said, they're not very good kids. I said, that's where it starts.
Let's take another question. Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is Jisoo. And my question, I just wanted to kind of leave it for everyone to kind of, I immigrated here, my family and I immigrated here when I was young. My parents actually immigrated here in 2001, right after 9/11. And it's taken them 13 years to get a green card, which is kind of ironic because 13 years. I was wondering if anyone ever talks about the economic problem that arises to these families due to these long extenuated immigration, rules and regulations. 13 years means an extension of the work permit every single year, which is also money. And then people who don't speak English constantly need lawyers, so that's also money. My parents constantly say that it costed them a house for 13 years. So I was wondering if anyone could actually talk about that.
That's a great question. Roberto, is that something you can speak to?
These are clear impediments, right, to upward mobility. These are clear impediments to growing a significant middle class of immigrant families. I think that a lot of people don't talk about this because it's very difficult to look at. I think that it's much easier for us to, Stevie posted the question earlier about kind of our focus on kind of the upwardly mobile. I think that a lot of immigrant families, a lot of immigrant kids have the opportunities or really could be upwardly mobile, but there's so many impediments in their way.
Yes, sir. Your question.
Hi, my name is Randy from the Korean American Research and Culture Center. I work as the immigrant rights organizer. So actually what Utz mentioned really well was that the wait time for family-sponsored visas is ridiculously long. Philippines is about 23 years on average, which is a good point. Followed with Mexico, China, Vietnam, and India. Four out of the 5 are Asian countries, which brings me to the subject of Asian immigration. A lot of times when people think about immigration reform, it's closely associated with the Latino communities. However, the Asian communities and African communities and all immigrant communities have a high stake in this bill too. Yeah, thanks. Part of the and also the diversity visas is also getting excluded too. So that's another thing I would like to bring up. My concern is that a lot of the Asian businesses are run by families, specifically siblings, and one of them was the E2 visa holders, where you have small business owners investing thousands of dollars for temporary visas to bring jobs, to help create jobs for their community. But also their kids, when they turn 18, they don't get legal permanent residency. Instead, they get an international student visa, so they disqualify from financial aid and other benefits. So the question I have maybe for you, Mr. Gonzalez, is can you touch more about the businesses, the small business owners in immigration reform?
Sure. I think that the reality of small business is that oftentimes the entire family works in small business, and that oftentimes these are kids. I spent a lot of my time the last 10 years in California, where there are large Asian American communities. And I guess one thing that I want to say tangential to this and on your earlier comment is that KRC, KRCC, NACASAC have been at the forefront of this issue for a long time, right? And really leaders in this issue, from the DREAM Act to comprehensive immigration reform. The other thing that I want to mention about undocumented Asian community, outside of Latin America, it's the second largest undocumented community. In the University of California system, undocumented Asian students are on par with undocumented Latino students, even though proportionally in the state there are a lot less. Nevertheless, it's an invisible community, right, in a lot of ways. And I think that what I want to tie an idea related to undocumented immigrants with another point that was mentioned about high achievers, right? Is that oftentimes we make assumptions. So Asian Americans, we've got this myth, this model minority myth, right? And for many people, it's a very positive myth. We also, parallel to this, have a dreamer myth, right? The assumption is that all undocumented youth are super high achievers, right? That they don't have any problems. Similar to this model minority myth, right? That all Asian Americans are superstars, they don't have any problems, they'll get to college just fine, right? As a result, what happens if you're a B average, C average student, right? What happens if your family is living in poverty? What happens if your family is living without legal immigration status, right? Is oftentimes a lot of those people, a lot of those in those communities get left behind and fall through the cracks.
Yes, sir, you had your hand up? Yeah, we'll get a microphone over to you.
It's actually two questions. Mr. Rowe, thank you very much for thinking with your heart in that sense, but you are fear, and you are right to have fear. You couldn't hire Cindy because knowingly that she's undocumented, you are facing fines and jail. And I'm wondering, because in 2006, immigrants marched by the hundreds of thousands because they didn't want to be labeled as criminals. But employers are indeed criminals. And this immigration reform law is going to further criminalize any employer who ever hires an undocumented worker. So what are you planning to do? And don't take it personally. I mean, from the point of view of a business person, what are you planning to do regarding that aspect of this immigration bill? The other question is, what do everybody think of the fact that this bill doesn't stop deportations? It may take months and months. It's going to be another 500,000 people deported before it's approved.
Two good questions, and let's let John Rowe respond to that first one. I mean, the proposal that's outlined in the Senate does still place some burdens on employers for verification, et cetera. Yeah.
I retired a little over a year ago, so the only employee I have anymore is the secretary, and she's been here for a generation or two. So in some sense, I don't have to deal with part of that problem. The way I see the bill, and I'm working like everybody off summaries that other people have prepared, and probably always will since reading 844 pages of congressional language doesn't appeal to me. But the way I see it is, if you don't get one of the work permits, it's going to be even more difficult than it has been to get employment. But huge numbers of people will get them, so rough justice, but better for both immigrants and employers than exists now. I mean, my company could hire Cindy if she goes through the steps. My company could hire Jessica X, whom I pay to go to college, and wants to be a nuclear engineer, whereas today, well, actually, she can get the Obama work permit, I think. But up until that, we couldn't have hired her. Now we can, and I can tell her she doesn't have to go back to a mythical home when she graduates. So a lot smaller realm left over for the problems that concern you.
And let me toss the second question, the deportation question, down to Otts and to Cindy. Cindy, you talked about, you know, I think we've had 1.4 million deportations during the first 4 years of the Obama administration, exceeding or the 8 years of the Bush administration before, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think the reality would be around deportations if a law like the one that's in play were to be, or a bill like the ones in play would be signed into law?
Yeah, I mean, already we have a quota. We have a quota of deporting, you know, 400,000 people every year, right? We deport 1,100 people every single day in the United States. And, you know, just personally, right, even though I'm protected from deportation, my parents are not. And so I think that's what we need to start thinking about, is that even if this immigration bill does happen, people will be left out. For me, I don't know if my parents will qualify for this, because my parents were stopped at the border when we were coming here, right? And so it makes you think of, you know, maybe it's not me, maybe it's my parents, maybe they are protected for this, maybe it's my neighbor who's not going to be able to adjust their status, and they're going to have to face deportation or the threat of deportation every single day, you know. And it's ridiculous that we're spending so much money on enforcement, so much money on the border, so much money on immigration and customs enforcement, and we still, you know, there still isn't a solution. People are going to keep coming back out of survival. People don't come here because they enjoy the weather and the, you know, the thunderstorms here in Chicago. They come out of survival, and that's what we need to realize.
Really quickly, your thought on that.
Really quickly, I think it's important to remember that even though halting the deportations is not in the bill, even though LGBT families are not in the bill, even though a lot of things that we want are not in the bill, it's not set in stone. It's finally out from behind closed doors, which means it's up for public debate, which means that you can contact your members of Congress and you can actually ask them to take action. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Yes, you're here now. I love it that you're here on this beautiful day and you're learning about this stuff, but you got to talk to people. You got to talk to your neighbors and people at church and whoever you hang out with, and make sure that they're contacting their members of Congress. So it's, what are we going to do?
We're going to let that be the last word on this conversation. We'll take a short break and come back with another. My thanks to Cindy Augustine, Otts Balisai, John Rowe, and Roberto Gonzalez. We'll take a short 5-minute break. We'll come back with panel 2 and more of your questions. Thanks so much.